Well, hi folks, and welcome to episode 132 of Retro Power Uncut. And we're going to start in the fabrication shop, as you can tell by my immediate surroundings. And we're going to start with the project Integra Allegro, as we were just saying. Actually, Project Lucky Strike, as it is called, for reasons which I will leave you to work out. The metalwork, not a lot has changed this week, so far this week. We're filming currently on Wednesday because the Friday is bank holiday, nobody's here on Friday, so Jamie's got to get things wrapped up tomorrow. And just to complicate things further, I was actually off on Monday because all of my family were ill. So it's been quite a short week for me. So consequently, I haven't hacked any more metal on this because I've been doing some other things. However, George has been very busy. So that's the major progress really on this is working out where we need to cut things, which is very important. So George has pieced together all the scan data that he has for the Integra, all of the scan data that he has for the Allegro, which is quite a lot in total. It's just as well he has a nice shiny new PC that can actually handle it all, because it's a humongous quantity of data. But he has all those scans, he has them all stitched together with reasonable accuracy. There's a few errors in the stitching, but nothing too drastic. And he has then pieced all that together, aligned everything on wheel centre lines, on the vertical centre lines that we discussed, and it all looks really pretty good. And he's now done the bulk of working out what we need to cut off. Certainly all the rough cuts can be done. I'd made a start on that last week, and we've got some pretty good markings for the accurate cuts. And what we're actually doing there is we're going to, George has basically overlaid the two lots of scan data together, and then used a tool in the Peel software that we use, the Peel to CAD software. You can actually put a plane through the scan data and use the intersect of that plane with the mesh to generate a DXF file, to generate a simple line profile of the intersect of that plane and the scan data. So he's done that in the areas where we know we're going to be tying the two bodies together, so that we can create profile sections which we can then cut on the CNC plasma and use them to do the fairly fine alignment of one body shell to the other. Because it's important to remember, I think I mentioned last week, that actually you don't have an awful lot of data. So by the time you have two vehicles with no wheels on, with most of the metalwork peeled off, it's very hard to line one up with the other. So those profile pieces will form quite a key piece of the alignment between one shell and the other, and actually part of the structure between one shell and the other as well. But that's an aside that we'll come on to as we get a bit further down the line. But that's the situation we're in at the moment, is that George has got probably 90% of the way through the primary scan work, I wouldn't call it CAD work, scan to CAD work, to enable us to align the two body shells and carry out the very rudimentary first stages of the metalwork. So that's good progress really. It's in the background compared to what's going on in here, but it's very, very important to the next steps on that project. Moving swiftly on, in fact we'll pause here. We're not really going to cover anything on Project Puma Escort because everybody's fed up with Escort, which I can understand. However, Tom's busy working on wheel arches again. He's very nearly done on the primary shaping on all the wheel arches now. Is this the last half or the penultimate? Last half. The last half arch is about to go. So, interestingly, the previous shots you've seen in previous weeks have pretty much all been at a similar stage where he's been pushing, he's been squeezing out tucks. So you can see what things look like before you generate any of the tucks, because that's basically a blank that he's just put a bit of a rough set into, so it sits on the jig nicely. And he's just setting up the bits of MDF and the piece of rubber that do form the initial clamp. So we'll try and clamp all the way around here, just back from this line, and this line sits roughly on that edge. So we'll clamp that as close as possible and practical to that line, and then start knocking this material over such that we get a nice indentation all the way around that line, and that gives us a grip on the tool then to stop this material migrating backwards, and then you can chase that material in and keep that line tight onto the tool until the point where you can actually then start clamping it down to these M10 tapped holes in the tool around here and get the wooden blocks bolted in to clamp it around there. Then you can start working back that way. So that's interesting to see it right at the beginning of the process. But yeah, we're on the final half arch. At that point it's got a pile of 8 halves, all of which then need splicing together. So he's going to do some setting work, which is basically making sure that they sit onto the jigs loosely without any gaps underneath them and without them being lifted off the jig by low spots, I suppose, in the metal. He'll get them to sit on there reasonably well. Once we've got to that stage, he can then do a trim. Actually, we'll do a trim before, a rough trim, get them sat on there, then do a tighter trim, work and get the parts exactly scribed up, get them TIG welded together, and then do a final set, as you call it, sticking them onto the jig, and then doing some more manipulation of the surface just to get them to sit exactly onto the jig. And then it'll be planishing them up, rechecking on the jig, and then getting them fitted to the car, which we'll cover again. And we are going to do, thanks for all the answers, we will do a full in-depth, step-by-step video on this job, just so, because people seem to want to see that, so we'll do in coming weeks, we will do a full step-by-step video on that process. Moving on from that, we have Jensen CV8, which we're now covering this side, because Bobby's now in here with this. And he's been busy on lots of bits all around the front end. If we look at the underside of the bonnet, you can see some fairly well cobbled in mounts for the bonnet catches. And the bonnet catches he's sort of bodged in with some filler and some insulation foam and whatever, any other bits of material that come to hand really, sort of mounting pads for those bonnet catches. They'll be trimmed up and tidied up and adjusted and altered later on to give us a profile to then take a mould off later, because this is obviously being made in, if you're new to the series, you won't realise this has all been made in carbon fibre, but those who watch us every week will already know that bonnet's being made in carbon fibre, so this is going to be a book for making the bonnet. The moulds will be taken from this, and those pieces, these sections here will be made out of, be shaped to a pleasing shape, so that the mould can be taken from those in carbon with threaded inserts actually moulded in, so that the bonnet catches will then be a permanent fixture on the carbon bonnet. So he's mounted those. They're a BMW catch. I've forgotten which BMW, but they're a BMW catch. And then down here, he's been working on the whole cooler pack in general. Previous episodes we've touched on the air intake arrangements and all the work around there, and the structure and the mock-up radiator that we'll be sending to Concept Racing to get the actual radiator made. He's then made a mock-up charge cooler radiator and the mounting structure for the charge cooler radiator, and that structure then also carries the condenser. So he's now made the sort of sub-mounting brackets for the condenser. They're done so that there's just one screw on each corner holding that onto the carrier that also carries the charge cooler radiator. So he's got that lot done. And then into all that structure where all that bolts onto the front of the car, he's also made these mountings for the actual latch mechanisms that will catch those. Quite cool bit. For those familiar with the Jensen CV8, we mentioned this before, but again, now the business bits are actually there, it's worth mentioning again. One of the key points, key sort of identifying things at the front of a CV8 is the slightly strange bonnet release mechanism. There's a little key lock in the bonnet with a thing that looked a bit like a fuel flap. You unlock that, lift it up, and then within there's a big lever that looks, to me, having driven tractors a lot, it's actually a bit like a tractor hand throttle lever. There's a big lever inside this sort of fuel flap type affair on the bonnet, and you undo that lever to release the bonnet, and that originally slid two pins out on the bonnet structure into two plastic bushed holes in a frame on the front here. We've changed this to a much more modern locking mechanism that isn't basically just a gate bolt, but we wanted to keep that original feature of the handle in there, because that's kind of part of a Jensen CV8. It's not something you really want to lose, because it was one of the sort of quirks to the car. So we have kept it. Bobby sort of came up with the idea of using these BMW catches, which have a remote cable for the safety. So we've got the main catches, they'll release remotely as a normal bonnet release would, and the bonnet will pop up onto these safety catches, and the safety catches are released by a cable that will go to, at the moment, goes to a plastic BMW bonnet release handle inside this box, but that'll be replaced by a handle that is similar, if not the same as, the original Jensen handle, mounted inside the original box, so it all looks original. You'll pull a bonnet release in the car, the bonnet will release onto the safeties, then you'll open the little flap and turn the handle to actually open it. So it's actually quite in keeping with the original concept and the original sort of theme of the car there. So yeah, Bobby's making good progress on that. His next steps, he was just telling me, he's working on power steering, reservoir mounting, dealing with that. Some of the structural brace tubes on the front of the car, he's got to get those in and do a bit of exhaust manifold mock-up. and then getting the charge cooler pump mounted and working out all the pipe routing for the charge cooler pipe work between the cooler core up here with its 2 outlets and the inlet and outlet on the, I think there and there. The inlet and outlets on the charge cooler radiator are there, the pumps resting on the bulkhead there, inlet and outlets for the cooler core there. So all the pipe work, that's got to be worked out and dealt with neatly. So that's his next steps there. Moving on from that, got Project Churchill. I'll stand here because I'm not going to get in the way of Stu, because he's busily working on it, but Jamie will have plenty of footage anyway. Stu's been doing a lot of finish welding. There's an awful lot of the inside of the back of the car that was tacked up while everything was made to fit that wasn't actually fully welded. So Stu's been doing a lot of finish welding work. He's finish welded the B posts into the roof perimeter frame. He's finished cleaning up and trimming out the remains of the original B pillar mounts. A couple of people, I don't know if that was picked up on videos or whether it was just mentioned to me personally. A couple of people had said about, oh, just welding the B posts onto the roof gutter like that and it not being very strong. Well, that's how they were. The original was just tacked to the roof frame and then had a bit of braze put either side of it. They were unbelievably weak, really. I imagine if you were hit with any degree of accident from the side of the car, the B post would just pop out of the roof frame. So it's actually welded in fully, not just brazed and tacked now. So it's actually stronger than it would have been originally. So they're welded in fully. Stu's done a bit of shaping work on the rear quarter window apertures because there was a little bit of the gutter was slightly misshaped on this side where it had been welded in. It just slightly misaligned. So he's actually put a little split in that and tweaked that a little bit and re-welded it just because we weren't quite happy with the alignment there. And then he's welded up all the inner structure of the C-pillar and the base of the C-pillar and the C-pillar mount to the inner wheel arch. And also some bits of finishing off on the bulkhead. Where we'd modified the rear bulkhead, there were some holes basically where we'd shortened things and there were gaps. He's been finishing off all those areas. And then he's made a nice neat little bracket where the handbrake mounts, we've covered the handbrake on a previous episode, where the handbrake mounts to the inner sill. He's created a little sort of steel trim section, if you like, that basically forms the recess where the handbrake lever bolts in and then gives us a little cover for the, I believe it's the battery cable to it's either the battery cable or the main loop. Can't remember which, one or the other, to shelter under this little cover just to prevent it getting trapped and damaged by anything. Just keeps it all out of the way and neat and tidy. So he's been on with that and probably some other things I've missed. But yeah, it's on that final trot. Well, it's not final, there's still a lot to do, don't get me wrong, but he's on the final push of getting all the little bits of welding work finished off, all of the small allowances for all of the myriad of bits and bobs. I mean, I can glance at the job list and there's sort of provisioning for battery cable through the car, provision for the engine loom in the engine bay, the holes in the inner wings for the front loom provision, shaping and trial fitting the front door seal retainers to these strips that Jaguar use for holding the door seals on. They're quite a tricky job to shape. Subwoofer provision, centre console mounting points onto the tunnel, all those sort of bits that people don't even think of when you're building a body shell, other than car manufacturers, but effectively we are a car manufacturer at this point and we have to think of all those things at this stage because we don't want to be doing them next door when the car's all shiny and painted. So that's the stage Stu's at. It's progressing really well. He's making good progress on that. So that's where we're at with that. Allegro, mentioned earlier, that's sat there on the jig, forlornly awaiting its mating session with the Integra. And then in the booth, there's Gary. You can see him through the window. He is putting the Raptor coating on the inner wing outer faces, not the engine bay side, but the outside, the dirt facing side of the inner wings on the Escort, and the Raptor coating on the inside of the outer wings. So that's all done, so that then we can clean it off on the weld lines before we weld the outer wings onto the car. We'll do a final alignment check back in the body prep bay, make sure everything's right, and then the wings will be welded on. But we do that after we've wrapped it. The Raptor's actually surprisingly heat resistant stuff. You can weld very, very close to it and it doesn't just burn off. It's surprisingly tough stuff. So you can get away with cleaning off a very narrow band where any welds have got to be done. 10 millimeters cleaned off is enough to not blister, as long as the welding's done with care. So what we do, we clean all that off in the areas it needs to be cleaned off, weld the wings on, and then we go back, nitpick any defects that we've caused in the Raptor, and then we touch up all the Raptor in the areas where the welds have been done. And it just means that we can get Raptor or a coating in in areas where it wasn't possible on the original cars. One of the reasons they rot so badly on the top of the inner wings is there's a crevice at the top of the back of the inner wing on an Escort where it's almost impossible to get a paint coating in once the wings are welded on, which is one of the reasons they didn't have any coating in there, and they rotted really badly from the factory. So that's what's going on there. So they'll be out of there again later on today, back through, and then the final inner wing fitment. And then in here we've got quite an interesting car lurking actually. This car was a car that we built for a customer almost exactly 10 years ago. This was finished. I think we started work on it in 2011 and we finished it in 2013, I think, somewhere around there. Rewinding a long way back in retro power history, in 2010 we undertook our first full customer car build, ground up build, which was an Ascona 400 replica, not unlike this one, but a white one. Now interestingly, that was for this guy's best mate, and they had, I believe they'd been to, I might get some of these facts wrong, so somebody, one of them will pick me up on this. I think they went to school together. They certainly did their apprenticeships together at BAE in Barrow, at the submarine yard in Barrow. They did their apprenticeships together there. And then life had separated them. They'd gone off doing their own separate things, moved to other parts of the country. One still lived in Barrow, the other had moved down to Cheshire, I believe, or North Wales. And they'd gone off doing their own things. And they hadn't spoken for ages. And the first chap had brought us his Ascona, which was red at the time. It ended up being white, and asked us if we could build a 400 replica. We did, you know, a long time ago that was, as I say. We did that, and that actually was the first car that kind of put us on the map. It was the first car that gained a lot of publicity and won quite a few trophies at shows. It was a very well regarded car. And it still is. He's still using it now, and it's still going now, and he still takes it to shows, and he's still, I believe he recently used it as his wedding car, or a couple of years ago he used it as his wedding car. But interestingly, the two guys happened to get back in touch just to sort of catch up. Oh, we haven't spoken for ages. One of them rang the other. They had a bit of a chat, and in that chat, it transpired that they'd both independently, but bizarrely both in Cumbria, bought two-door Ascona B right-hand drive cars. Now bear in mind there's probably only maybe 6 two-door Ascona B right-hand drive cars in existence in the UK. That's pretty unlikely, but they both bought them independently and had both sort of got them sat there and weren't sure what to do with them. Now by this point the first guy had actually commissioned us to build his, but the customer of this car was then sort of egged on into getting his done by the first guy. So we then built this car, and the engine choice, the rest of it, Ascona 400 replica, these have got 4HA axles in them, Salisbury 4HA axles, just because they're strong. We use that in both of them. Bracketed similarly to, actually in this car, bracketed with an Escort type 4-link setup. In the other car, bracketed with a setup that to the uninitiated looks like a 400 setup. It isn't, but it looks like a genuine 400 setup. This car runs a Getrag 265 gearbox, the other car runs a Getrag R30 gearbox. Both cars running C20XC Vauxhall red top engines, but interestingly at a show with the first Ascona that we built, with the first customer and the owner of this car together, with quite a few beers inside us all, I had mentioned the fact that I was contemplating building an Eaton M90 supercharged C20XE engine for my autograss car at the time. And we got chatting about what that would do, and that I predicted we'd be able to run around a bar of boost thereabouts, and that I thought it would be good for 300 horsepower and should have a really, really sort of steam engine-like torque curve, just a straight line horizontal torque curve, and I thought it would be a pretty impressive engine. And the owner of this car then said, "Oh, why don't you build that for me?" And I said, "Well, okay, because I'm never going to get around to the bloody autograss car, because I never have time because of building cars here for customers." So he had the supercharger from me, and we kind of prototyped it all on this, and that's the setup that this car has. It has an Eaton supercharged C20XE, which made pretty much exactly what we predicted. It makes somewhere, I mean, it's actually better now. When we first built it, I think it was around 240 foot-pounds of torque, but it made over 200 foot-pounds of torque from idle. It's just ludicrous. It makes 200 foot-pounds of torque at something like 1300 RPM, and the peak power's around 300 horsepower. I think it's a little bit more than that now. But incredible thing to drive. You just huge torque, barely need a gearbox sort of thing to drive. Traction's the limiting factor. However, it recently had a bit of a bump. It had an altercation with a wall, not the owner's fault, unfortunately at low speed, which damaged the wing. And the wings are a bit of a nightmare on this car because this was built prior to, there's a company, there's a guy in Holland, Erwin Peters, who makes a really good 400 replica, Ascona 400 replica body kit. That didn't exist when we built this car, so we built the wings from original steel wings and then grafted on sections, and they were a nightmare to do. And they're not really compatible with the Erwin Peters parts, so we really were committed to rebuilding the wing that was on the car, which is what the guys are doing now. They've got it pretty good, considering it's like a couple of days in. They've got the wing pretty much right, they've pulled the front of the car straight, got all the front end straightened out. It's coming together quite well. So this is all getting pieced back together, get the body prep redone, get all the parts painted, and then Jason can get back out in this car and enjoy himself in it again with it all back in one piece. So I think that rounds off things quite nicely on the fabrication front. So over to Cal.
Right, okay, thank you very much, Nat. I'm going to get my Roundstone Retro Power brew and have a look. There's been a lot coming and going. As we saw last week, we had Utah here for a bit for a service, Vader for much the same, and an intercom fit. Kaiser 2 left us last week. And then, as you've already seen, the Ascona arrived. And then, as well as all of those comings and goings, we have an old friend, which the longer term followers will have seen it not that long ago. Mark II Escort, which we built, oh, goodness knows how long ago. It was probably 9 years ago, I guess. Now this recently changed hands, basically between two of our clients. And it's back here for a bit of a service. It actually developed a bit of a misfire, which we were all worried about what it might be, but it was just that two of the plug leads had come off the coil pack somehow, so that was an easy fix. And then we've just done a general check over, spanner check, fluid check, oil change, and she's good to go again. So this, I think, actually is going later today. As I've said before, absolutely awesome car to drive. There's nothing too sort of, you know, overly complicated or excessively thought out about it. This was built years ago, so our general standard of build is, you know, way higher now. But it's just nice and simple and effective, makes the awesome noise, goes sideways easily, does what you want a Mark II Escort to do. So a very cool thing, leaving us very shortly. I'll just quickly pop over to the Camaro. Not a great deal on this. We just finished off the tail end of the Dynamat last week. And actually, I've only just seen this now, I've just got Scott to throw this Recaro in. We were trying to decide what seats to use in it. I'm always a bit of a sucker for Recaro LXs. They're just incredibly comfortable, very compact, so they look at home in an older car. Very low, so and a lot of these older muscle cars, the steering wheels are really low and you have to sit very low down in them, otherwise your knees are too close, so they're very low, which is good. And they've just got a kind of inoffensive appearance to them, which suits a lot of styles, sort of all the way from kind of the late 60s to the early 90s. They look quite at home. So this is the first time I've seen it. I'm going to have a good look at that, send some pictures to the owner and see if that style of seat is going to work. Because the next thing we've got to do on this is make some seat mountings for it with a view to completing the rest of the interior. James in the background here is just finishing off the tail end of the Morris boot trim panelling. We've got the lamp that we were using on that now for the boot illumination, so it's just doing the holes for that, and then that lot can go away for leather after that. It's sod's law, we've had some nice days in terms of weather this week, and then I've been too busy to get out in it, so we're trying to get the stars to align and have a decent weather day when I've actually got the time to set aside to get some miles on it, but that's really the next step on that. Right, let's have a little wander over here. If you go to that side, Jamie. E-Type. This is probably where more of the progress this week has been focused. So a few angles of attack. Scott's been on with the gearbox crossmember. It's pretty straightforward on this actually. It's more or less just a flat plate in, I think he's done it in really thick, probably 5mm thick steel, maybe 4. And some captive nut plates to attach that to the floor. Not being E-type aficionados, I don't entirely understand why the cross member that came with the gearbox conversion kit doesn't fit this floor. I'm assuming there's different lengths, although we did tell them that it was a Series 2, 2+2, so I'm not quite sure, but anyway, we've made a new one of those, and we have a revised prop, which is the correct length now, so that's good. Adam has been on with the fuel system plumbing, so I think we were just starting that last week. We're starting to make up these hard lines that run around the throttle bodies, and we put a bit of thought into how we're going to do the fuel plumbing. I'm going to go this side just because the visual reminders will be there this side. What we decided on the end was to run these all the way around, and then we've mounted a plate off the bottom of the front throttle body, which has two 90-degree bulkhead fittings into it, and that's where we transition from the hard line that's attached to this to the flexi lines that allow for the engine movement when you get to the body. And then we've done another similar bracket off the rear, which just additionally supports this hard line. So that kind of hard line assembly with the two bulkhead plates is kind of a rigid attachment to the throttle bodies. And then we're running flexis from there. One of these goes down to the pressure regulator, which is in the return line from there back to the fuel tank. And then the other one will go via a fuel filter, which we're mounting here. So there is a splash shield that sits in here, kind of has a 90-degree fold in it. We've decided that was a nice place to mount the fuel filter, and we're going to remake that in a slightly thicker material because it's not really substantial enough to mount something off. It would be mounted, but I think it might crack over time, so we're remaking that in slightly thicker material and putting an additional fold on the top so it's got some more mounting points here, so it's a bit more rigidly supported. That then has got the fuel filter attached to it, and then it just allows for really neat plumbing routing then, so where the pipes come up from underneath here, the one from the regulator and the one from the fuel feed line there will come up neatly side by side. One be clipped up next to the fuel filter, the other one go via the fuel filter, and then you'll have two parallel flexi lines coming off the top of here, which then go to the back of the bulkhead fittings here on 180-degree fittings. So it's just really nice. All the flexi lines are parallel and clipped together. This lot's a nice rigid assembly altogether. So loving the way that's coming together. And the other sort of big excitement this week was the chrome. So massive batch of chrome plating for this car all went together to Derby Plating, and Derby Plating, as usual, have absolutely knocked it out of the park. We have tried various people over the years. Now I think we've probably been consistently using Derby Plating for the last 6 years, I'd say, maybe 5. And I just wouldn't use anyone else now. It's just every time, and the chrome on this, some of it was really in a poor state. But we decided to go with using the original parts on the basis of them likely to be being a better fit, even though the surface was very badly corroded and pitted, rather than going for new parts. And I think it was the right decision. You know, the stuff's come back, and I just absolutely can't fault it. The polishing is the thing that blows our minds. That it's so easy to get ripples in big long surfaces like the bumpers, because obviously they build them up initially with copper, polish all that back and then chrome it, and the risk of getting undulations in the surface is so high. I honestly don't know how they get it so good, but yeah, really impressed. Derby Plating, chrome, so yeah, looking forward to seeing that start to take shape, because that actually was something that was holding up a lot of jobs going forward on this car. So now that's here, we can make a lot of visual progress on that. I think now we're happy that everything engine-wise fits. We're going to drop that out, do the tweak on the transmission tunnel we need for the clearance on the gearbox, and some little trimming of excess bits of casting on the gearbox that aren't necessary and that are tight on the tunnel, and then we'll get that back in for the final time. There's a few bits of anodising have gone away on this as well. So we made a bracket to hold the idle air control valve. I was talking about that last week. That was aluminium, so that's gone for anodising. The pulleys that came with the off-the-shelf aftermarket power steering pump kit, they've gone. They were just a bare alloy finish, so they've gone to be anodised. And then along with that sort of group of anodising was the parts that we've been waiting to have anodised on this, which are the intake manifold The main part of the cam covers, not the top plates, they've already been done, but the main body of the cam covers. The fuel rails, which Jim finished machining, they was in process with them last week, and then the brackets, which is what he's been on with this last few days, was getting the brackets that attach the fuel rails to the manifold. And with that done, that gave us a massive batch of anodising all to go off together. Hopefully that lot will be done for early next week, and then we can crack on with this. So yeah, I'll be excited to see this take shape. We'll basically then be getting the new, our own design cam covers on. We've got to put the baffle plates in the back of those, the seals that seal the plug tubes into them, get those on. Then we can get the intake manifold on, the throttle body, fuel rails. We're going to then, I've actually just was having a look at this a minute ago, this loom, we're going to sort the routing of that, because we actually designed the cam covers to have the wiring for all the coil packs and injectors routed through them, and also the wiring that comes out of the front of the engine, which is the neatest routing down to things like the starter on that side and the aircon compressor on this side and the oil sensors on this side. They actually also come through those cam covers, and they've got attachment points in there, and then they come out of the front as a really neat way of routing down the front. So we'll be able to route all that wiring, get that buttoned up, put the top plates on. Then we're into filling fluids, pressurising the fuel system, checking the Venturi pump works. Then we can get the interior in, we can get the transmission tunnel in once the gearbox oil's in. So it's this kind of domino effect that's been waiting for fuel rails. But yeah, we're getting close, and I can't wait to see the progress take shape on this. I will, at that point, I'm going to answer a few questions, as I've been saying I will endeavour to do, or we will jointly endeavour to do each week. So I've sort of screenshotted a few actually this time. I'm going to start with an obvious and sort of simple one, and a little bit of me thinks, well, if you don't understand why, perhaps you don't get it, but it's a question which was, Russ Cook, Allegro body on the Integra floor, why is that? I don't understand, please explain, because I don't know why. Essentially, it's the desire to have a car that perhaps you wouldn't associate with being a performance car that is exciting to drive. It's bringing the driving experience to the visuals that you want. And that actually is probably a good summary of a lot of what we're doing here. With a lot of these cars, one of the big appeals of them is the appearance, but what tends to let them down is the driving experience. And it's the same with the Allegro. The idea with that is that somebody wants to take a car that you don't really associate with being a cool or performance car, but make it look cool, and then add the performance, so it'll have, you know, the interior will be totally brought up to scratch in terms of the quality. The driving experience hopefully will be similar to an Integra Type R. That's certainly our intention, only more so because with individual throttle bodies, etc., that we've got planned for it, it'll have a bit more noise, a little bit more rawness to it. So yeah, that's the idea. It's a sort of thinking outside the box thing. And I think you probably realise a lot of our clients are reasonably well off. And at that point, when you get to the stage where you can buy most off-the-shelf cars, a lot of them don't seem exciting anymore. And so trying to think of something madcap that's going to be a talking point and turn heads is the aim of the game. So that's why. So Phil Tucker, with the zinc metal spray gun. Clearly an integral zinc container as part of the gun is not practical. Please explain why. That's because it is solid zinc metal. It's not a liquid. It is literally a wire of zinc. It's a solid zinc wire being fed into the gun. Obviously zinc's quite a flexible metal, so that wire can be coiled up on a spool. But it's the gun itself that has an oxypropane feed to it, and there's a little air feed as well. So you've got an air feed which drives a turbine which powers the wire in, and then an oxypropane flame which literally melts the metal in the gun, and then the air then also sprays it out. So essentially the gun melts solid zinc to be a hot molten metal, and then the gun sprays it out. So obviously having a container on the gun, unless you had a way of holding a vat of molten zinc on the gun, which obviously would be very difficult to achieve and extremely dangerous, it doesn't really work that way. And obviously there's the weight issue as well. So we have the zinc wire on a massive spool, which is very heavy on the floor, and you sort of unwind it as you're going, and the gun feeds it in. So that's that. Bob Turner, we haven't seen any action on the E-Type Roadster lately. Has it been placed on the back burner? No, it hasn't. It's over at KS Composites, our carbon experts, who are in the process of taking a mould from the bonnet. So the last thing we were doing on that was sculpting the revised shape of the bonnet. It's gone over there for them to take a mould because we're going to do the bonnet in carbon fibre. So that should be back in the next few weeks, and then we will be getting back on with that fairly intensively. The last one I'm going to go is Joe Limag. How does the 6-cylinder Jag engine with the injection throttle body setup, blue E-Type here, compare to the Utah engine, which was a Toyota 2JZ? It's a good question. Now, obviously, this project is, by our standards, not a wild modification project. The customer, in this case, was going for almost a restoration, but sneaking some changes in under the skin without wildly changing it. And I will say straight off, the XK6 is actually a fantastic engine, but obviously it's very old now. You know, it's 1960s sort of technology, very advanced for the day and pretty powerful. But with a clean sheet, when we were designing Utah, we wanted to consider other options. And one thing you'll notice looking at that is it's a massive engine. It's very big. It's relatively heavy, mainly because of its size. And there are various details of its design which, with the passing of time, aren't as good as they could be. So yeah, our decision on when we did Utah was kind of with a blank canvas. We wanted a 6-cylinder to make the 6-cylinder noise, but could we use something that was a bit more modern? Everything's available brand new with actual OEM manufacturer quality to it. Smaller, lighter, and you've only got to look in the engine bay of Utah to see how much smaller the 2JZ is. And they're a very different beast. In the proof is in the pudding. Actually, Ian, who owns Utah, absolutely loves the engine. It's one of the things he always raves about, is just the sort of noise of it, and you know, that sort of eagerness to rev. So when you start getting into the higher rev ranges, it then gets more and more eager, and you really want to push it, and it turns into a bit of a screamer. This is bigger capacity, so very torquey, but perhaps a slightly lazier power delivery, and definitely more suits a sort of GT type cruiser like this. And the 2JZ's perfectly happy cruising around. You know, it's pretty docile to cruise around in as well. But yeah, I'd say the main driving factor in the sort of differences in choices is just that this was always intended to be more of a factory restoration. If we were approaching this car and going total clean sheet from the start, what would be the best power plant to be if it was a straight 6, we'd probably end up with something very similar. What we might end up with is a project that we've got booked in the future, which is a BMW S54. The S54 engine is kicked as an E46 M3 engine. It's kicked well over to one side, and that would make it unsuitable for Project Utah. But actually, if we could have used one of those on Utah, we probably would have done. So if I had a blank canvas with an E-Type to create the ultimate straight 6 E-Type, I probably would use a BMW S54 engine. So yeah, watch this space on that one. And on that note, we shall see you next week.
Hello guys, this is Rich. He's just viewing his new trailer.
We don't do many of these here for various reasons, but I'm stupid, so I'm going to kill myself with this.
Yeah. Rich, would you like to take the cover off? That's like undoing a bra. Just like
around the back, like that. You ready?
Oh! Do you see that, guys? That's called an anti-surge compressor valve.
It goes.
Rich is going for
Death.
boots.